Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and thank you for bringing something like clement weather with you for the first time in, well, rather a while. My name is David Worsley, the co-owner of Wordsworth Books in Waterloo. I would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Atawanaran, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. The Center for International Governance Innovation is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations, that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. Any proper noun mistakes in that were entirely my own. Along with CIGI, the Center for International Governance Innovation, Wordsworth is thrilled and honored to welcome Chris Hedges to Waterloo this evening. I'd like to thank the CIGI staff, in particular Andrea Harding and Brian Atchison, for their help in putting all of this together, for getting all of the details right, and for crossing all of the I's and T's. Penguin Random House of Canada for overlooking a whole bunch of unpaid invoices from Wordsworth, and who's still getting copies of America the Farewell Tour to us this evening. Thank you, Penguin Random House. CIGI's mandate focuses on, among many other things really, the global economy, global security and politics, and international law. When we heard from the aforementioned Penguin Random House that Chris was touring Canada, we asked if CIGI would co-host a possible book launch. Given the content of the new book, there is, well, simply not a better partner or venue. Chris Hedges is the author of 13 books. He is a journalist, a Presbyterian minister. He was a foreign correspondent for about 20 years, reporting from all over the world. He is a columnist for the progressive news site Truthdig, which in addition to this, is required reading. Right from the first book, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, Chris Hedges has established himself as a progressive voice in American discourse with a reporter's eye for story, with the evocative and fluid nature of his writing, and his singular ability to bring politics into the home and into the street. In a time when mere facts are in dispute, to say nothing of political solutions and the mechanics to bring them to the fore, we need both infrastructure like CIGI and voices like Chris Hedges more than ever. Chris will be up here in a mere moment. He will be joined a little bit later by Darren Malloy. Darren is the chair of the history department at Wilfrid Laurier University, and he teaches widely on American history with a particular interest in the US since the end of the Second World War. Darren has written 3 books, including the just released, Enemies of the State, The Radical Right in America, from FDR to Trump. That is my time. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Chris Hedges.
Thank you. I am going to take 30 or 40 minutes and try and explain what's happened in the United States and perhaps talk a little bit about where I think it's headed. Donald Trump is the result of a long process of decay of democratic institutions, an assault against the economy and the culture by corporate power. He's the natural consequence of a degenerate society. He is the symptom, not the disease. And since I came back from overseas, I have written several books that have attempted to diagnose what's gone wrong in the United States. Death of the Liberal Class, Empire of Illusion, The End of Literacy, and the Triumph of Spectacle, American Fascists, The Christian Right, and the War on America. And I did not use the word fascist lightly. I am a seminary graduate, and in fact am, although I don't broadcast it much, an ordained Presbyterian minister. I look at these people as Christian heretics who have distorted the biblical message to sacralize the worst elements of American imperialism and American capitalism. And part of my critique against the liberal class includes the failure of the liberal church to call these people out for who they are. You don't have to spend 3 years, as I did at Harvard Divinity School, to understand that Jesus did not come to make us rich. I did a book with the great cartoonist Joe Sacco called Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, where we went to the poorest pockets of the United States, literally, Camden, New Jersey, for example, which per capita is the poorest city in America, and not surprisingly, always has one of the highest homicide rates in America, to talk about sacrifice zones. And that, of course, is something you as Canadians have to cope with, the tar sands being one of the largest sacrifice zones in North America, along with the coal fields of southern West Virginia, northern Kentucky, where we also wrote a chapter. And if you want to understand what a poisoned, toxic landscape looks like when these people are finished, you should fly, as Joe and I did, over the denuded and scarred Appalachian Mountains with the tops blown off and the trees gone and billion-gallon toxic ponds of lead and heavy metals. Every 2 hours we were driving through these old coal fields. We'd have to stop and clean off our back window because it was black with dust. You went into elementary schools and you went to the nurse's office and there were just rows of little inhalers with the name of every child on it. That's the world that these corporations will create as the globe becomes one big sacrifice zone. John Ralston Saul, who I had dinner with last night in Toronto, talks about a corporate coup d'etat in slow motion. And that's a phrase I often use because I think it's correct. We saw, and it's hardly unique to the United States, an assault by global corporations, beginning in particular in the early 1970s, to roll back what the Harvard political scientist Samuel Huntington called the excess of democracy. And if you know about Lewis Powell, he later went on to sit on the Supreme Court. The Powell Memo of 1971, it's called Attack on the Free Enterprise System. He actually names Ralph Nader in that memo as somebody that they have to take down. At the time, Ralph running the largest and most effective consumer advocacy movement in the country. And you saw the elites essentially seize control not only of academia, whole economic departments, purging critics of global capitalism, unfettered capitalism, what we call neoliberalism, taking control of media platforms, and most importantly, capturing through corporate money our two major political parties. We only really at this point in America have one political party. It's called the corporate party. You have the right wing of the corporate party promoting the kind of nativism and Islamophobia and demonization of undocumented workers, and then you have the kind of more enlightened wing of the corporate party, which doesn't want to be seen as racist or misogynist, but the structures of power, both imperial and economic, remain completely untouched, which is why you have complete continuity, for instance, between the Bush administration and the Obama administration. And I spent a lot of time in Death of the Liberal Class. I actually go all the way back to World War I with Wilson, because on the eve of World War I, we had very powerful radical movements that were on the cusp of taking power. And they were effectively crushed during the war in the name of fighting anti-war sentiment, and then destroyed afterwards in the Palmer raids and the Red Scare. But Clinton, we had a couple resurgences. One being with the breakdown of capitalism in the 30s, and then again in the 1960s. But by the time Bill Clinton came to power, he had essentially transformed the Democratic Party into the Republican Party, and he had pushed the Republican Party so far to the right that it became insane. And much of the devastation that we're dealing with, including NAFTA or the 1994 Omnibus Crime Bill, which exploded our prison population from 700,000 to 2 million, or the deregulation of the FCC, which now allows about 5 or 6 corporations to control what 90% of Americans watch or listen to. Glass-Steagall, and Canada did not have a banking crisis because Chrétien did not allow the firewalls between commercial and investment banks to be ripped down the way Clinton did, precipitating both the national and the global meltdown. And I would say that our moment of distress began, was accelerated by the betrayal of the Democratic Party under Clinton, which knew that if it did corporate bidding, it would get corporate money, which it did. So by the 90s, the Democratic Party had fundraising parity with the Republicans, and when Barack Obama ran for president in 2008, he actually got more corporate money than his Republican rival. So the devastation was accelerated. The deindustrialization was accelerated. And that American working class, and in particular the white working class, began to fall into a state of tremendous distress. Barbara Ehrenreich, in her very fine book, Nickel and Dimed, calls the plight of the working poor in the United States one long emergency. At the same time, we became captive to, or entertainment, let's say, seeped into every aspect of American life, including, of course, info entertainment, but also in terms of politics. Politicians surrounded themselves with very skillful public relations mandarins who created fictional personalities. If you remember, George Bush is somebody you'd want to have a beer with, kind of stuff. And we were made to confuse how we were made to feel with knowledge. Political rhetoric became almost childlike, so cliche-ridden, so slogan-ridden, as to be utterly devoid of content. And what we watched in this last presidential election with Trump, and Trump, of course, himself his public persona is a manufactured personality on the reality television show The Apprentice. His actual record as a business person is abysmal. Numerous bankruptcies, defrauding contractors and creditors, and when you watch the Mueller investigation, it's very clear that what they have on Trump is not any serious collusion with Russia, or Russia did not steal our elections, but dirty money from Russian oligarchs and the Russian mob that Trump laundered, I hear, through Cypriot banks into his failing real estate empire. But Trump, who comes out of that reality television culture, was able to play the reality television game better than Jeb Bush or Mitt Romney or, in the end, Hillary Clinton. And the invective, the vulgarity, all of this stuff for a population that has largely lost faith in the ruling elites and lost faith in the ruling ideology of neoliberalism, at least was cathartic in a sense that it expressed the rage and, I would argue, legitimate rage by a dispossessed American working class, and in particular, white working class. So there's been a long period of severe decay within American society, which is not reported on. It's been rendered invisible by cable outlets such as CNN, which is endless burlesque, which actually fuels and feeds the reality television presidency. If you go back and look at the presidential election, Trump had 23 times the airtime of Bernie Sanders because Trump was unpredictable, mercurial, entertaining in a way that Sanders wasn't. And since the election, as the head of CBS and others, Zucker, have admitted, Trump has proved to be extremely good for business. CNN made more money, $1 billion last year, than they've ever made. But of course, it accelerates the assault against American democracy. It is all gossip from porn stars or the lawyers of porn stars who want to run for president, or former reality television personalities like Omarosa, or endless speculation about what a member of the power elite will or won't do. And meanwhile, the plight of the vast majority of Americans goes unrecognized and unreported. And what I set out to do in this book, as opposed to the other books, was visit, and I was all over the country for 2 years, visit communities that had been hit by this economic assault and this concentration of wealth into the hands of an American oligarchic class, so that income disparity is now greater than it was in the Gilded Age. It's worse than it's ever been in the United States. What that was doing to people psychologically, emotionally, as well as physically. We always have models, or writers do, I do certainly, models for books. When I did Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, with Joe Sacco, the model was Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, with Walker Evans taking the photographs and James Agee writing the book. This book, it was Emile Durkheim's study of suicide that he published in the late 19th century in France, where he went and tried to explore what is it that drove people to commit suicide. And that's where he coins the term anomie, that alienation, that disconnectedness, that sense of stagnation, despair, a loss of worth, that plunged people into a state where they wanted to take their own life. And American society, and again, this is something that Canadian society copes with, is plagued by an opioid epidemic. 76,000 Americans died of overdoses last year, and many of them, many thousands more came close and were revived. Gambling and suicide, the rise of white hate groups, and so I went to these. I was with heroin addicts. I was with white hate groups. I was with dispossessed workers. For instance, in Anderson, Indiana, where GM originally had many of its major plants. Now they all moved to Monterrey, Mexico, where they're paying Mexican workers $3 an hour without benefits. And so these old UAW auto workers who made $25 or $30 an hour, had pension plans, had medical benefits, had a union to provide or protect them from corporate abuse. They lost their jobs, all of them, 25,000 of them, and the city went into free fall. So in Anderson, looks like many of the deindustrialized wastelands across the United States, which is suffering from, of course, they built a casino as a form of economic development, and with the opioid abuse. I mean, it's all of those attendant problems, all of those pathologies that come out of a decayed or destroyed culture. And I wanted to look at those pathologies, explain the personal suffering, pain that a society, when it seizes up, inflicts on its citizenry. I wrote my chapter on gambling out of the Trump Taj Mahal in Atlantic City before Donald Trump ever announced he was running for president. And at that point, the Taj had fallen into deep decline. There was rodents all over the place. I mean, people would sit in one of the downstairs restaurants and watch the mice run across the floor. There was mold, mildew, rooms were mothballed, attics were shooting up in the elevators, a kind of window into the world or the America Donald Trump is about to create. And the common denominator that I found, most people, I didn't know this till I began the book, most people who gamble on slots. 80% of gamblers go to slot machines, which are designed to anesthetize you, to turn you into kind of zombie-like state, much like heroin or opioids. And the gaming industry or the gambling industry is quite astute about how to build an environment by which you lose all sense of time or space. That's why there are no clocks, there are no windows. People will sit for hours, and it's called time on device. And of course, they're completely tracked. Many of the mechanisms of the security and surveillance state are actually taken from the gambling industry, which creates very sophisticated profiles. I mean, even to the point where they have projected how much a habitual gambler will spend during his or her lifetime. I wanted in the book to, I think, focus on that, what Durkheim called that anomie, to make it clear that if we didn't radically restructure our society, these pathologies would only grow. And we're flirting now with a very dangerous situation, another economic collapse, and even the New York Times, which is usually extremely cautious, ran an editorial 2 or 3 days ago talking about that possibility as whatever tepid reforms have been were created under Dodd-Frank being removed under the Trump administration. But this time around, the financial elites don't have a plan B. They can't lower interest rates any more than they were already lowered to virtually zero. And you saw central banks in Europe actually paying people to borrow money. So you have these huge financial institutions like Goldman Sachs, and within the American political system, it is impossible to vote against the interests of Goldman Sachs. You can't do it, doesn't matter who you vote for, that extract, and numbers vary, $4-7 trillion, much of it just printed money, fabricated money, what Marx called fictitious capital, and what they do with it is not, they don't build new manufacturing centers, they don't create jobs, they use money to make money. And the way they do it is through 2 ways. Debt peonage, which is severe debt, student loan debt, for instance, in the United States is now almost $1.5 trillion, which is not, these kids cannot pay it back. I mean, this is probably the first bubble to go. And now we saw with these recent tax cuts, what they're doing is buying back their own stock. That's why the stock market is so inflated. So they're buying back their own stock because their compensation packages are tied to the value of the stock of the major managers and CEOs. But all of this is unsustainable in the long term. And the failure on the parts of the elites to deal with the pathologies that they have unleashed and the rise of a demagogue like Trump I think it is potentially extremely dangerous for the trajectory of the United States. We have, if you take a list of the characteristics of late dying empires, whether it's the Roman Empire or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, we have managed to check almost all of them off, including what is often a common characteristic of late empire, and that's disastrous and self-destructive military adventurism. You saw it, the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. You can go all the way back and look at ancient Athens in the Athenian Empire when they invade Sicily and their entire navy is destroyed and most of their soldiers are killed. The empire breaks apart. Austro-Hungarian Empire starting World War I over the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand and his wife Sophie. This is a characteristic of late empire. And the British, for instance, in 1956, when they attempted to invade Egypt when Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. Now, the British Empire had been in a slow decline since the end of World War I, but this is what finished them off. They had to retreat in humiliation. The pound sterling was dropped as the world's reserve currency, and the British economy went into freefall. So that's I think, the fear of major historians and writers about empire, Alfred McCoy and others, is that once the dollar is dropped as the world's reserve currency, the empire contracts very swiftly and very violently. Although foreign wars become unsustainable, imports become very expensive, and with the weakening of the traditional liberal class and the destruction of radical populist movements, including the destruction of labor unions, we're in a very different situation than we were in the 1930s, when you had powerful movements, and people write the Communist Party out of the American history, but it was an important movement, the progressives, the old CIO, that pressured Roosevelt to respond. Roosevelt's saying, if the private sector can't create jobs, then it is the job of the government as last resort to create employment, and that's where you get 12 million jobs and Social Security. And Roosevelt says that his greatest achievement is that he saved capitalism. But our situation today is extremely different. And you have, with the loss of credibility of both democratic institutions and the ruling ideology, and no real vision, ideological vision to take its place, this is very fertile ground for proto-fascist demagogues. Paul Krugman, who's often very sober, had a column yesterday that talked about the United States becoming Hungary, which is about as close to a modern version of fascism as you can get. You look at Trump. I mean, I would just say that going back and looking at those presidential elections that we went through, when this period of history is written, I think the greatest tragedy is that if the Democratic Party leadership had not fixed the primaries against Bernie Sanders, he not only would have won, but he would have beaten Trump. He might have been paralyzed, probably would be paralyzed in Washington with a Republican-controlled Congress, but you wouldn't get the kinds of appointments, Betsy DeVos, who's privatizing education, the destruction of the EPA, and the massive tax cuts that will extract or over a 10-year period mean the federal revenue will decline or will lose $1.5 trillion. And I think the ruling elites are well aware that across the political spectrum they've lost credibility. I think that fear of a loss of credibility manifests itself in what they're doing to critics of capitalism and imperialism who already are pushed off of public broadcasting, pushed to the margins of the internet. But you see this attempt to attack figures such as myself as agents of a foreign power. You have anonymous and shadowy groups, prop or not, propaganda or not, which we still don't know who's behind it, trumpeted on the front page of the Washington Post, listing sites, including all major left-wing sites in the United States, Counterpunch, Alternet, Truth Out, Truth Dig, World Socialist Website, Black Agenda Report, as disseminating Russian propaganda, although it's completely false. And that triggered Google, Twitter, Facebook to impose algorithms to divert traffic away from these sites. So, for instance, I write a weekly column every Monday for Truth Dig, and you have what they call impressions. So if you went to Google and you typed in imperialism, and I had written a column recently on imperialism, it would come up with other articles. Now it won't, because those algorithms serve as filters. So the referrals from algorithms on TruthDig alone have fallen in the last 12 months from over 700,000 to below 200,000. And Alternet's traffic is down by 63%. And I think that's because the ruling elites don't have a counter-argument anymore. And so therefore, these critics become more dangerous. You couple that with the abolition of net neutrality, where you can tier the internet, and you have a very effective mechanism by which you can already take marginalized voices and critics and analysis, which does not appear on media platforms, including public broadcasting, which is now a wholly owned subsidiary of the Koch brothers, and you further diminish its ability to reach a public. I mean, we sometimes forget in America that if you went back to the 1960s and you looked at public broadcasting, you could see Noam Chomsky, who's been blacklisted for years, including by my paper, The New York Times, my former paper. You could see Malcolm X, James Baldwin, Howard Zinn, Ralph Nader. And those voices have all vanished from the American landscape. And what's risen to take its place is a kleptocrat, a con artist, and all of the kleptocrats around him, who have turbocharged or accelerated the pillage of the nation, and I should say the pillage of the very structures of government that maintain a capitalist democracy. And this, of course, was an understanding that Karl Marx had. When he wrote about the late stages of capitalism, he said there comes a point when capitalists unable to extract profit from an exploited working class who's had its wages decline. I mean, wages in the United States are technically they're stagnant, but in real terms, of course, they've declined since the 70s. Then they start cannibalizing the very systems, the governmental systems that make that capitalist democracy possible. And that, of course, if you look at the Department of Education under Betsy DeVos, it is about privatizing public education, because the federal government in the United States spends about $63 billion a year on public education, and the hedge funds want it, and they're going to get it. It is about everything becomes privatized. We have our brother, Eric Prince, arguing now that the war in Afghanistan should be privatized. 70% of U.S. intelligence gathering is privatized. Bose Allen Hamilton, for instance, where Edward Snowden left from, 99% of its revenue comes from the federal government. I teach in a prison. You still have state and federal structures nominally running the prison, but internally, for-profit corporations have taken over every aspect, the commissary, the money transfer, the phone rates, which are astronomical, far higher than, and this is, for me, particularly cruel, since for most incarcerated parents, the only connection they have with their children is through the telephone. And now they have email, absurdly priced emails. I think it's 40 cents an email or something, all sorts of fines. That if you go to a prison, Dostoevsky once wrote that if you want to understand the true nature of a society, go to a prison and watch what they do to the most vulnerable. And now we are seeing corporations being lobbied by prison officials in the United States to come back and use bonded labor in the prisons. They said, you don't need to be in Bangladesh and pay 22 or 32 cents an hour. You can come to the prison and pay 20. The workers if you're in prison and you have a job, you're paid 22 cents an hour in the state of New Jersey. That's $28 a month. If you're in Alabama, you're not paid at all. And we now have huge corporations. McDonald's, for instance, makes its uniforms in prison. You have huge corporations, 1 million prisoners working in China-like conditions within the American prison system. And of course, they can't strike. They can't complain about their working conditions. They're not paid for sick days. There's no vacation time, obviously no benefits. And if they ever cause a problem, they're locked in solitary confinement for 1 or 2 years. And this is the natural trajectory of where we're headed unless we rise up and stop it. And none of the political figures within the United States have any intent of addressing the social inequality, which is becoming more and more pronounced by the day, which has fueled these pathologies and created a situation whereby this cabal, in essence, this cabal of oligarchs and corporatists have redirected the mechanisms that once made piecemeal and incremental reform possible towards enriching and empowering themselves. And any time a cabal, whether it's monarchical, fascist, communist, or corporate, seizes power, the political system, in essence, seizes up. It doesn't work as it's designed to work. It works to concentrate more and more wealth and power for this cabal. And the propaganda that is fed to this disenfranchised working class, which began under Reagan and Thatcher, is that, and of course this is Reagan's great line, government is not the solution, government is the problem. Well, government is also the only mechanism by which the citizens can defend themselves from predators, from especially corporate predators. And they change the narrative to one of your personal identity is under assault. They did this, Thatcher did this in Britain, and of course we've ended up with Brexit and figures like Boris Johnson, and Reagan did it in the United States. And you have a proliferation now of nihilistic violent acts, constant mass shootings, and the rise of heavily armed right-wing proto-fascist hate groups who are being increasingly, as things deteriorate, being given license by the highest levels of the federal government, by the White House, to carry out acts of violence. And you watch Trump's rhetoric, which is an incitement to violence. You look at his recent speech to evangelicals, and that's Hofstadter's The Paranoid Style of American Politics, projecting acts of violence or saying that their opponents, in particular in the Democratic Party, intend to carry out violence. And what I fear is that we live in a period at this moment of relative stability. But at that moment that the next crash comes, at that moment when finally the dollar is dropped as the reserve currency, we have set in place political forces that will create a very frightening dystopia and make America, at least as we have known it throughout our lifetimes, unrecognizable. One has to always be cognizant of the fact that the DNA of American society is deeply violent. We are a nation founded on genocide, on slavery. And we believe to this day in violence as a form of purification, regeneration through violence. We fetishize the guns and the gun culture. The NRA, which is just a creation of the arms lobby, of the weapons manufacturers, is disseminating assault-style weapons throughout the country. And rather than rationally respond to this madness, our latest solution is to put concealed handguns on kindergarten teachers. So I will close by saying that unless, and I'm not predicting this, but unless the United States builds mass movements that can carry out sustained acts of nonviolent civil disobedience, such as we saw at Standing Rock, such as you had here in Canada with the First Nations peoples or the Quebec student movement, any mechanism to halt this slide into corporate tyranny will be taken from us. The ripple effect will be, you will feel it. Canada's not immune. It won't become, the problems will never be as pronounced as they are in the United States because empires themselves are by nature fragile entities. They depend on the extraction of resources abroad, the control of foreign labor, whereas Canada, not being an imperial power, is more self-contained. But nevertheless, you won't be free. We see it with the election of Ford. You don't have anywhere near the mass shootings we do, but you have them. You have, your prime minister is very Obama-like, and we see it with his refusal to stand up to the fossil fuel industry and the tar sands. And the consequences of that are dangerous. I mean, the tragedy of Obama's election is that he came in with a kind of mandate. And he, perhaps because of political inexperience, he had only spent 2 years in the Senate, perhaps because of cynicism, I don't know, he re-empowered these elites by re-inflating these financial houses and banks which had defrauded the American citizen and defrauded institutions. City pension plans were wiped out by 40%, and nothing was ever done to address the crimes that were committed against the victims. I didn't even mention climate change. But you throw climate change in there, and every climate change report that you read has one subtext, which is that it's happening far faster than any of us predicted. And so, as I write in the book, we have to resist, because if we don't resist, we can't use the word hope. And yet at the same time, and perhaps that's our greatest existential crisis, we also have to understand how bleak the situation is around us. That there is a moral dimension to resistance. I don't fight fascists in the end because I'll win. I fight fascists because they are fascists. What Kant or Hannah Arendt would have called radical evil, forces of thanatos or death, as Freud would have pointed out. And there's very, very little time left. We will stand up to these forces that are disemboweling our nations, that are destroying our democratic institutions, and that have commodified the ecosystem for short-term profit, or we will soon have to begin to face the very real possibility of the extinction of the human species. We are at a moment in human history, this 10,000-year period, when the climate created conditions by which we built human civilizations, moved from settled societies to cities. is rapidly drawing to a close. And to be complacent is to be complicit. I'm not the only person in this room to have children, and yes, we may fail, but at least let's rise up so that our own children can look back and say we tried. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris, for a really wonderful book and a stimulating talk as well. So let me explain how this part of the evening will work. I have 3 or 4 questions that I'll ask of Chris to get things going. And then you'll see there are 2 microphones in here, one each at the front of the room here. I'll turn it open to you, and you can come down and ask questions of Chris. I'd ask if you just ask 1 question per speaker. That would be ideal. And I also have some questions from people who are watching in the overflow room around the corner. Okay, Chris, so America the Farewell Tour is an angry book. It's one that also has a great deal of compassion, I think, in it, for the people that you've met and the dire circumstances that they find themselves in. But I'd like to begin with a question about the political utility of anger, particularly as it seems to be anger is one of the defining features of the age that we currently find ourselves in. So can anger be constructive? Is it useful?
Yes, I teach in a prison. If you don't walk out the door of that prison and you're not angry at what has been done to these people, then you lack compassion. Augustine said that hope has 2 beautiful daughters, anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to see that they don't remain the way they are. That's different from hatred. But if you can't be angry at what they're doing to the natural world, to democratic, open societies, to the poor, and to the young, I would like to say. One of the things that's so heartbreaking, and it was something that I constantly ran into reporting this book, was the hopelessness of these kids who could, if they were fortunate, they got a low-wage job. But it wasn't a sustainable income. It wasn't a job that offered them any kind of a meaningful future. It wasn't a job where they felt they were contributing to society. And that, I think, was most heartbreaking, to crush the dreams of the young in the name of profit. Is one of the greatest crimes of corporate power.
Can we talk about American stories and American myths? One thing that's always struck me about United States is how persistent some of these myths are. And one that seems to have undergone like a real revival in recent years is the myth of American exceptionalism. And you point out in the book this is one that's shared by liberals and conservatives throughout the United States society. So why do you consider the myth of American exceptionalism to be such a damaging one, a toxic brew?
Right. Well, James Baldwin, I think, probably addressed this as well as any American writer. And his argument was that the longer, essentially, the white power structure refused to confront what they had done and who they were, the longer they manufactured this faux innocence and goodness and virtue, the more monstrous they became. And Donald Trump is a kind of figure that exemplifies this utter inability to be not just self-critical, but truthful. And American society, one of the reasons that corporate power assaults public education, and in particular makes war on the humanities, is because when the humanities are taught right, they teach you not what to think, but how to think. They are by nature subversive because you are meant to critique structures of power, ask questions that the ruling elites don't want asked. And so from every level, from the bottom to the top of American society, it has become vocational. So if you are in a marginal community, you are given enough literacy, numerical literacy, to work in a fast food restaurant or stack shelves in a Walmart. If you're at Princeton, and I've taught there, and the biggest major at Princeton is computer science, which is also true at Harvard, you are trained vocational, you've given vocational training to work at Goldman Sachs. So you become a systems manager at simply a higher level. You become a manager who's compensated quite a bit, but your job is to maintain the system, not to question it. So when we had the 2008 crash, there was no ability to question the system. It was only about reinflating it. As Ralph Nader pointed out, with that kind of money, we could have created public banks in every state. We could have given them $10 billion each. They could have leveraged themselves 10 to 1. And all these people whose mortgages were underwater could have been given new mortgages. But the mandarins in power who come out of these institutions are not even trained to ask those questions. And I think what's so frightening about the elites now is that they're utterly unplugged from the real world. They don't fly commercial airlines. They live, a writer for the New Yorker called it, they don't even live in America. They live in Richistan, and it's global. And yet they have total power. So if you read Joseph Tainer's The Collapse of Complex Societies, where he talks about how societies collapse, he looks at 24 civilizations. He said in that final stage, the elites retreat into their version of Versailles or the Forbidden City, utterly unaware of what's happening outside the gates. And to maintain a level of opulence and hedonism, they push a population with diminished resources harder and harder and harder until it goes down. And that's precisely what's going on.
In this book and in previous books, and you alluded to it earlier today, you've been highly critical of the Christian right in the United States. So can you help us understand the seemingly unwavering, yet also incredibly hypocritical support that the Christian right has for the current incumbent in the White House?
See, I don't look at it as hypocritical. I spent 2 years writing that book, and I went, and like any reporter, and that's the only way you understand, I think, I went to megachurch services, I went to creationist weekends. Actually, I took a course to be certified to teach creationism. But it's fascinating because it's in the details that you understand the absurdity of it. So according to creationism, the account of the creation of the world in Genesis is factually true. But it does create a problem because God doesn't create a light until the fourth day. So our teacher was saying, well, just tell them that God created a temporary light. Well, that's not in Genesis. But it's there that you see the species of magical thinking that is endemic, as Hannah Arendt points out, to all forms of totalitarianism. These megachurch pastors are Trumpian. They are phenomenally wealthy. They pray and make their fortune, they're millionaires, off of people's despair by promising them that magic Jesus will solve all of their problems as long as they keep giving seed gifts and buying prayer cloths and all this kind of stuff. They have created a classic system of totalitarian indoctrination where you invite people into the service, which has nice music, and unlike the Presbyterian church, there's like comfortable chairs to sit. But then they suck you into what, again, going back to Arendt, calls the systems of indoctrination, which we don't see. So suddenly all of your educational time, your leisure time, your religious time is occupied by this church. You are assigned a discipler. Any kind of questioning becomes backsliding. And I read, when I was writing this book, Margaret Singer's book called Cults in Our Midst. And I really came to believe that this was cultish. And I went in there with the usual prejudices of the liberal Christian. But the more I interviewed these people, the more their stories broke my heart. Sexual abuse, domestic abuse, evictions, prolonged and chronic underemployment or unemployment, splintered families, opioid addictions, alcoholism. And that's why they have this lust for the end times. And I went to an end times weekend in Detroit. It was appropriately located with Tim LaHaye. And they have this whole, the rapture is never in the Bible. I mean, this stuff's just totally invented. But I really came to see, by being around these people, that they hate. I think the core emotion of this movement is hate. They hate the world. They hate the real world for almost destroying them. And at the end of that book, I came to the conclusion that the only way we will break this movement is to reintegrate these people back into the economy, to give them stability, to give them a sustainable income, to give them hope. And you will never talk them out of this belief. In fact, if you begin to try and challenge them, they get incredibly defensive and incredibly angry. So Trump is a natural. And the sexual proclivities of these megapastors is right in sync with Trump's lifestyle. I mean, look at Jim and Tammy Faye Baker. People say it's hypocritical. How could Trump? No, it's a perfect marriage. They're a political movement. They're about the prosperity gospel. They're not about the gospel. They're about their perversion of the gospel. They're about preying on people in despair. They are about sacralizing the American empire, fusing the iconography and language of American patriotism with the Christian religion. And we saw that in Germany with the German Christian church. And that's what they are. And my attack on liberals, especially liberal Christians, is that in the name of tolerance, they gave these people a credibility they should never have had.
That was one of my other questions was, why do you give liberals such a hard time?
Because they are hypocrites. They want the appearance of morality without actually engaging in a moral struggle. They want to posit themselves as the moral center while never taking risks. I mean, King saw this at the end of the civil rights movement. So liberals were willing, white liberals in the North, were willing to support King's efforts for desegregation. But once King called for economic justice, and King understood that if there was not economic justice, there would never be racial justice, the liberals went for the door. And the liberal class and Chomsky, I think, has done, for me, the best job of explaining the role of a liberal class in a capitalist democracy. The liberal class functions as a safety valve so that it can ameliorate or adjust the system, like Roosevelt did. It can decry the excesses of the system without ever questioning the system itself. But in exchange for, in a capitalist democracy, in exchange for giving liberals their positions in universities or on the media, the quid pro quo is that they discredit radicals. They discredit people who question the motives of those who started the war in Vietnam or those who started the war in Iraq. And I've been a victim of that. I mean, I was very outspoken against the war in Iraq. And I was a prime target because I had been the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times. So I actually understood the Middle East, had spent months of my life in Iraq, and understood the instrument of war. And so, by name, I was fiercely attacked by the liberal class, who were all useful idiots for George Bush, and because they had to take me down. Now, once the war went bad, they were able to do mea culpas and say, well, we meant well, they meant well, but it was misguided, it was wrong. And that's really mendacious because they didn't make a mistake. They played the role to which they were allotted. And that's why all of these people who were completely wrong about the war in Iraq, starting with Thomas Friedman, still have the perches that they have because they played their role very well. And you know, in my book, Death of the Liberal Class, I talk a lot about this. But as I told Noam, I should have put him in as a co-author because I think my entire understanding of liberalism comes from Noam Chomsky, yeah.
So this is my last question then, so I invite you to start to come down if you have any questions you'd like to ask Chris. So the singer-songwriter Steve Earle often describes himself as a socialist who lives in a country without a viable socialist party. And I'm wondering if you feel the same, and also what you think would be required to change this. You know, is the creation of a viable socialist party an even remotely likely event in the near future of the United States?
It's extremely remote, sadly, because I believe that if we responded in a rational way to what's happening, that would mean a massive jobs program, especially targeted at people under the age of 25, a rational health care system for all citizens. I know your system is underfunded, and that's intentional, but you know, where people had access to good health care without having to have for-profit insurance corporations hold their sick children hostage while they try and bankrupt themselves to save their sons or daughters, a guaranteed minimum income, reparations for African Americans, that's very high on my list because it's not only a matter of justice, it is a matter of white America coming to grips with what they did and who they are. I mean, as John Ralston Saul has often pointed out, these trade agreements are really masks. They're not really trade agreements. They have been used as a subterfuge to create gigantic tax havens for huge financial industries and corporations at the expense of the citizenry, to gut all sorts of labor and environmental regulations. I'm not against trade agreements. I'm against what these what's advertised as trade agreements, the forgiving of student debt. I mean, it's obscene what we've done to these kids. If we began to institute, these are all, you know, socialist. I gave a talk at, I think it was the University of Winnipeg, and I finished, and in the back row was the economics faculty, and before I could begin to answer questions, one of the professors stood up and said, I just want all the students to know that he's not a Marxist, he's just a radical Keynesian. And it turns out they were all Marxists, which I thought was so healthy. You'd never see that in America. If you didn't sign on to neoliberal economics, you would never get an appointment anywhere. And actually, he's right. I'm a kind of radical Keynesian. I mean, my idea of socialism comes out of the Scandinavian countries in the 1980s, and they've had rollbacks, of course, where they eradicated poverty, where mentally ill people did not have to sleep on heating grates, or were thrown in prison. 25% of our prison population has severe mental disorders, and I'm in the prison. They are drugged with psychotropic drugs all day long. They sleep all day. Where a public school teacher, a senior public school teacher would earn as much as a doctor. We have created worlds like that, and that is the only way our society will heal. Unfortunately, you're right. The left has been destroyed. The liberal class has been destroyed. We don't even have a media platform to get. There's no debate. If you watch American media, certainly the electronic media, they never debate health care. They never allow proponents of single-payer universal on, because factually we spend more than any other industrialized country. I think it's 18% of GDP, and we have the least efficient healthcare service in the world, with all the statistics to prove it. But the for-profit insurance, pharmaceutical, healthcare, they have a lock on what information gets out and what doesn't. So with a corroded media platform, with the destruction of even the liberal wing within the Democratic Party, with the death of labor unions. 6% of the American workforce outside the public sector is even unionized, and the union leadership is often completely bankrupt. So you saw it with the teachers' strike, which in Oklahoma and other states, which is a sign of hope, Virginia or West Virginia, and but they defied their own, people don't often remember, they defied their own union leadership, which called them to sign the contract. So if we don't have that kind of movement and we continue to barrel towards the kind of economic collapse that is coming, then we will go the way countries in Europe went in the 1930s. I mean, people, the Nazi Party in 1928 was in the single digits. Then you had the 1929 crash. You had the Social Democrats in power. But what did they do? They catered to the demands of the world banking system, imposed punishing austerity measures. This was Ebert, including revoking unemployment insurance. It was insane and suicidal. And it elevated these, and believe me, in Germany, in Weimar Germany, the Nazis were as buffoonish as Donald Trump. And that was true also in Yugoslavia. Everybody knew Radovan Karadzic was a nut, but they were so angry at the system, and they had every right to be angry at the system. And I don't take Trump's very open incitements to violence lightly, because I watched Slobodan Milosevic, Karadzic, and others use the same kind of rhetoric in the lead up to the war in Yugoslavia.
Thank you. So let's open it up to the audience. First question there, yeah, thank you.
Sego, Sewagego, welcome to the Grand River Watershed. So it's one of the largest watersheds, very important in southwestern Ontario, and a bit of a bellwether. So things that we do here have a habit of catching on, you know, because we're trendy. We discharge into Lake Erie. And Lake Erie, as far as the Great Lakes are concerned, if you, by any measure, is a lake in trouble, one of the Great Lakes in trouble. So one of the things that we're considering here with things like the water school for decision makers and whatnot is integrating with public school curriculum, which is then available to any school, but creating curriculum and specifically combining indigenous science with modern technology in order to bring the standards and the regulatory framework up to where it needs to be for the public to fight off predatory development and then integrate that with our legislative framework. So my question for you is, on your side of the medicine line, what's your feel for the willingness or the desire of educators in the public system on the American side to co-create some new water laws for our shared watersheds, since I think it's in the Great Lakes region. There's Ontario, the province of Ontario, and like 7 states or something like that. Actually, maybe it could be 8.
Well, the public school system in the United States is in deep distress. They don't even have basic supplies. Teachers have to, often out of diminished salaries, buy the supplies, including toilet paper. They'll send out letters where parents have to send in items like toilet paper for the kids. And this is all by design. It is about creating charter schools, which are, it's that STEM model, where it's all about science, technology, math, as a way to slot people into the corporate mechanism. So we're very far away. I mean, much of the textbooks, for instance, in the United States, are controlled by these right-wing entities like Texas. I mean, it's kind of appalling, actually, what is inside school textbooks in the United States, which glorify Robert E. Lee, minimize the slavery, essentially erase the labor struggles and the radical movements and the radical figures that, as Howard Zinn pointed out, opened up democracy. So we're not anywhere near. I mean, maybe you'll get there. Canada has a habit of copying us years later, but right now you're in a far healthier situation than we are.
So one of the things that is proposed that puts us in that healthier situation, Sorry. Oh, sorry. There's
Just grab me afterwards. I'm not going anywhere.
oh, that's okay.
This is the third time I've heard you, Mr. Hedges. I just want to say once again, thank you for being the prophet Amos in our midst. I much appreciate that very much. I do have a question, though. I take some heart in the 50th anniversary, the second Resurrection City campaign in the States. Could you comment on that, the 50-year, where William Barber II and Liz Theo Harris? That strikes me as a good step in the right direction.
Yeah, you're from the Poor People's Campaign.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they're addressing the issue. I know the Democratic Party is trying as hard as they can to co-opt Barber,
Of course.
which I hope they don't do, because the Democratic Party is as culpable for what's happened as the Republican Party.
Amen.
But I did attend their protests in Washington, and I think they're doing heroic work. Yeah.
Cool, thank you.
Hello there. As a recent undergraduate graduate of economics from the University of Waterloo, you mentioned about something about sustainable finance and how it's not being taught in the Harvard and Stanford schools. I specialized in trade and finance with a major in economics. I'm wondering what you think would be the best education available in sustainable finance. It's something that I've looked into, tried to find programs in that realm. I haven't been able to find anything yet.
Well, the sustainable finance means taxing the rich at 90%. That's sustainable finance. That's what we used to have. Under Eisenhower, it was 91% for the wealthiest elites. Even when I lived in Switzerland, taxes were about 50%. But we had a great educational system. We had probably the best healthcare system, one of the best healthcare systems in the world. David K. Johnston has written about this. These large corporations, many of them have just orchestrated tax boycotts. And that is socialism. We have to begin to tax the hell out of these people to rebuild our society.
But no specific programs that you have in mind?
Well, that's a specific program. Believe me, if Goldman Sachs had to pay 90% income tax, that would, and ExxonMobil and Citibank and Raytheon and everyone else, Bank of America didn't pay any taxes, zero. We can't fund. Money's got to come from somewhere, and of course we have to slash the military. The bloated U.S. military is one of the primary causes of the economic decay within the United States. Yeah, well, we beat you quite. We spend $1 trillion a year on the military. That's also characteristic of late empire. The late Roman Empire was trying to field a 1 million man army. But I think taxation. It's not about you can't teach people how to responsibly manage their money when they don't have any money. Ralph Nader is not wrong. He calls these supranational global corporations traitors to the nation state, and that's what they are. And we are going to wrest back control so that we focus not on maximizing profit but on the common good, or we're all going to go down.
So before we go to another question in this room, I have a question from the overflow room. So considering the polarization occurring in the US and also globally, what do you foresee happening to our societies? And perhaps the second question is the one you can answer in more detail. How can we as members of this society address this issue?
I think we have to look to the revolutions in Eastern Europe, which I covered, East Germany, the former Czechoslovakia, Romania, where large numbers of citizens just took to the streets 500,000 people every night in Wenceslas Square in Prague, and I was there. I was in the Magic Lantern Theater every night with Václav Havel. The demonstrations in Leipzig, and ending with, again, 500,000 people in Alexanderplatz in East Berlin. And the moral force is on our side because internally, these people know how gamed, rigged, and corrupt the system is. And as the theorists of revolution, like Crane Brinton, Jeffrey Davies, and others have pointed out, and I am talking about revolution, although nonviolent, because revolutions are fundamentally nonviolent. Even Lenin, whose brother was hanged because of an assassination, the assassination of Alexander II, even the Russian Revolution was nonviolent in this sense that once significant sectors of control defect, the government crumbles. So, for instance, when the Cossacks are sent to crush the bread riots and refuse and join the crowd, the Tsar's finished. He can't even get back. He has to abdicate in a railway carriage on a siding. Same was true in East Germany, where Honecker sent down an elite paratroop division to fire on the demonstrators in Leipzig. When the paratroopers got there, the local communist authorities refused to deploy them in the streets. Honecker was out in a week. And I think the elites are well aware of how discredited they are. And that is why they have passed a series of laws, including Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act in the United States, which overturns the 1878 Posse Comitatus Act, which banned the military from acting as a domestic police force. That was actually done under Obama. I sued him in federal court. I won, to his chagrin and the chagrin of the NSA, and it's a long story, but they appealed, and they won on appeal by denying me standing, not by actually going to trial. So you have the wholesale surveillance, the militarization of police, the revoking of due process. I mean, 94% of the people in our prison system never had a jury trial. And Hannah Arendt, to go back to Hannah Arendt, again writes about this when she talks about the status of the stateless in Europe. She herself stripped of her German citizenship after being held by the Gestapo for 3 weeks and is in France. And she said, when you have a segment of your population that is stripped of their rights, then rights become privileges. And you have already created both a legal and a physical mechanism that in a period of unrest means everyone can be stripped of their rights or their privilege. They're running scenarios, right and left, pretty cold-blooded scenarios. They are certainly preparing for unrest, and the way they are preparing for it is the Iron Boot. We're never going to win the game of violence. This is my battle with Antifa and the Black Bloc, who, you just saw Trump refer to Antifa, which is the idea that Antifa is even worthy of mention as a serious counterweight to the state. But part of my battle is that they are effective only in allowing the power elites to demonize the resistance and to justify more draconian forms of control in the streets. They play into the hands of the state. But if we were able to build a sustained, if we pulled those kinds of numbers, if we did what the Spaniards did, where we surrounded the Congress, if people were able to nonviolently essentially put themselves out in the street to discredit, there are enough people within the system who are tasked with defending that system who would not. And that's what they fear. I mean, I spent a lot of time in Zuccotti Park in Occupy, and what frightened the elites was these couples who would come in on the weekend from New Jersey with their strollers up. That terrified them. And they know. And you know, the relationship with the New York City police was quite fascinating to watch, because the actual violence was almost always carried out by, we call them the white shirts, the officers. But when the white shirts weren't around, there was quite a bit of fraternization between the blue uniform police and the kids in the park. You saw with the Chicago teachers' strike that the teachers, when they went on strike, the Chicago police opened up the precinct houses so that they could use the bathrooms, and often applauded them. That terrifies the state. That's the way we're going to bring them down. I'm not saying we will bring them down, but that is the only mechanism by which we will bring them down.
Yes, sir.
Okay, forgive the metaphor I'm about to use, but after listening to your address, I feel a lot like we're small boats bobbing on a large wave. And when you talk about rebellion, I wonder if you would address how this room full of people, after we leave and go to our various parking lots, go about that. Whom do we rebel against, and how?
Well, every community has issues of corporate abuse, every single one. So, for instance, in Denton, Texas, where the city is near fracking sites, and children were getting respiratory and all sorts of other diseases, the city voted to ban fracking, or mobilized and voted to ban fracking. The state legislature passed a bill denying the city the right to ban fracking. I mean, you can be sure that they're not going to take this line down. They will respond. I'm not from Waterloo, but I can guarantee you that there's stuff going down your railroad tracks that should be blocked. There are corporations in your midst that are destroying your community. I'm just not versed in, but it's everywhere. You can't escape it. And I think in the end, resistance will be local. It'll begin local. I was at Standing Rock, and that was very, very powerful and very moving, indigenous-led. It had a deep spiritual element, 7 months of resistance, and this was under Obama. The state responded with such ferocity and fear. Over 700 arrests, numerous beatings, the use of attack dogs, using water cannons to spray protesters in sub-freezing temperature, and the water was often laced with pepper spray. Constant surveillance overhead. You saw them, the drones, the planes. When I got there in November, they'd already blocked most of the roads, and I had to go all the way around and come in from the other side on these dirt roads. But even then, I would be stopped, and I would be stopped not by law enforcement, but by people who were dressed in black, wearing Kevlar vests, carrying long-barreled weapons, who had no identification. They were just private company goons, mercenaries. And you can be sure that when we begin to resist, you'll know that you're having an effect, because you will meet that kind of response. So local food is an issue. Anything that you can do to sever your reliance on corporate power. So sustainable agriculture, anything you can do to begin to cripple corporate power. I mean, that's why I became a vegan, because the animal agriculture industry, many people argue, is as destructive, maybe more destructive than the fossil fuel industry. And it's an easy thing for everyone to get up to do, and it's also better for your health. So, in both the minutia of our daily lives as well as the lives of our community, we have to be cognizant of what's happening, and we have to organize. And you have to organize. We have to build relationships to pit power against power, and we have to recognize that those relationships can only be built the way relationships are always built, and that's face-to-face, not electronically. If you sit alone in front of your computer, writing screeds on Facebook about climate change, you are exactly where the corporate powers want you to be alone in your room in front of a screen.
So this is our last question of the evening.
Oh, lucky me. Hi, Chris. I've been following you for a while, and I'm very glad you're here, and thank you for your great work. Recently, I've become quite interested in tipping points. And how did you see that? Did you see any sort of tipping points in those nonviolent revolutions you covered in Europe, and how they came about, and anything?
Well, that's a fascinating question, because so having covered those revolutions, what I learned is that the purported leaders of the revolution spend all of their time scrambling to understand what's happening. That when people rise up, I mean, remember that the demonstrations in Leipzig began largely led by Lutheran clergy, and their one demand was that the government give them legal status. And it ended with the destruction of the Stasi state and the end of the Berlin Wall. I mean, I was in Leipzig on the afternoon of November 9th with the leaders of the East German Revolution. And one of them said to me, maybe in a year we'll have free passage back and forth across the Berlin Wall. By 7 o'clock that night, the Berlin Wall did not exist as an impediment to human traffic. Lenin, 6 weeks before the Bolshevik Revolution, or the Russian Revolution, gives a speech in Switzerland and said, well, you know, people my age, we won't see the revolution in our lifetime. No one knows. What is the tipping point? It's usually something so mundane, so banal, but it just, it pushes a population over the edge. And no one can predict it. I mean, that's where my hope lies. I know that Tinder is there. I don't know what will light it. I don't know when it will be lit, but it's there. And so, I mean, what was moving about the revolution in Czechoslovakia was the figure of Havel, because Havel was a non-person in communist Czechoslovakia. If you wanted to hear Havel, you had to listen to Voice of America. And many of you know the history of Havel and in and out of jail and stuff. And he wasn't a very charismatic speaker or, you know, but he had the moral authority, and everyone in Czechoslovakia knew it. And he had been resisting since Charter 77 for a long time at great personal cost, and they knew he would not sell them out. You know, a population is often more cognizant than it appears on the surface. So a story I have told before, but in Prague that winter, there were posters of Jan Palach all around the city. Now, Jan Palach had been a young Charles University student, had gone to Wenceslas Square to protest the 1968 Soviet invasion and overthrow of Dubček. And he'd lit himself on fire, and 4 days later he died of his burns. His funeral, which attracted hundreds, maybe thousands of students, was never covered by the state media. When he was buried and his grave became a shrine, his body was exhumed and his remains were cremated, his ashes were given to his mother, and she was told she couldn't rebury them. A week after the communist government fell, 10,000 Czechs marched to Red Army Square and renamed it Jan Palach Square. Marta Kubasheva, the great singer who sang A Prayer for Marta, which was the anthem of defiance that was broadcast over the airwaves as the Soviets invaded, once Dubček was overthrown and the pro-Soviet regime was installed, her entire recording stock was destroyed. She was banned from the airwaves, and for the intervening years, she worked on an assembly line at a toy factory. I was in Wenceslas Square with 500,000 Czechs when she walked out on the balcony. It was December, it was snowing, and she began to sing the prayer for Marta. And every Czech in the crowd knew every word. That's the power of resistance. It has a moral force. It is, as Daniel Berrigan once told me when I asked him to define faith, It is the belief that the good draws to it the good. And empirically, everything around us may say otherwise. But I believe that that's right, that in the end, resistance against radical evil is an act of faith. It is the belief that the good draws to it the good. It is what Auden calls that ironic point of light that flashes out wherever the just exchange their messages. That our job, even however lonely it may be at that moment, is to keep that narrative alive. And if we can keep that narrative alive, then we can use the word hope.
So by way of closing and thanks, let me just make one or 2 points. One, through 13 or so books and now the last 90 minutes, we know what makes Chris Hedges, and we've now had in this region and at CG, and all of you in the overflow room, speaking of electronic communication, and on the web, a sense of what the power of the argument is. And in my sense, it is that Chris brings us the power of observation of the journalist and combines that with the breadth and depth and analysis of the philosopher and historian, and in the process sobers us up a lot. In fact, in his most recent book, by all means, please buy it. We have a reception and signing ceremony outside. The chapters have such scintillating titles as Heroin, Hate, Sadism, Decay. There's even a chapter called Freedom, which is actually all about the jailing system in the US. But through it all, there's also, as we saw in the question and answer and the speech, hope. That there's things we can do both locally and nationally and globally. That there are systems out there and that they're not all necessarily radical systems. The Scandinavian model, which in some senses you highlighted, has been with us as a social democratic model for a good century or so. And so, although it might seem dark and it might seem as if Canada's just behind the US in these things, the fact is there's also hope left to take care of some of these chapter titles before they become reality. Finally, I thought in the last answer, Chris reminded us that as in everything else in life, in Revolution 2, timing is everything. And we don't always get it right, and we can't predict it. But thank you, Chris. Thank you, Darren Malloy. Thank you, David Worsley. Always a pleasure to work with Wordsworth Books here at CG. Thank you all for joining. Let me also say before we break that this is, you've got us off, Chris, to a great start. We usually begin our programs at CG, the public ones, in September, but you've beaten us, again, timing, by a week. And given us a houseful show. October 17, by the way, we're showing a film here called Human Wave, which is a film by Ai Weiwei on migration and refugees and all of that. And it too is promises to be an evening to remember. But for this evening, thank you again, Chris. Thank you all for joining, and have a great evening.